So a rather big 40k stats update from Games Workshop. Let's take a look at their official win rates for who's over and underperforming in Warhammer 40k right now, and what they're intending to do about so many armies being either underpowered or overtuned. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a quick video to talk through Games Workshop's latest Metawatch update, the series that they do to mainly talk about game balance in Warhammer 40k, what's coming next, and what the current state of the game is with which armies doing well or badly. So far in 10th edition they've done a few of these updates, though hadn't actually published any tournament data yet or any win rate statistics, though I did think that when they did get round to doing that, most people would probably not be expecting it to be in such a very healthy shape. The main content of this one was the big table of win rates and calling out a few factions and certain reasons why they might be overtuned or underpowered, plus giving us a little bit more details as to what might be happening with the balance updates. Looks like they've given us a bit of a better time frame for when the balance updates happen in September, and also seem to imply that it's not just points that are changing, but there might be a few key rules changed as well. As with most of the time with these, they try and underline their normal balance philosophy, mainly looking at faction win rates as their first metric and trying to keep them somewhere between 45 and 55%. That usually tends to be their first priority, to make all of the factions have at least a somewhat good chance of winning any one game, though obviously things aren't going that way right now. And also talking about the more complex things within a faction, trying to make sure that no datasheets are just completely useless and never used by an army. Again, certainly in early 10th edition there's a lot of armies that tend to rely around just one or two really strong units, and have a lot of stuff that's mediocre, or just some units that are incredibly bad compared with the rest of the army. As per normal, they talk about their normal things about win rates aren't everything for balancing factions, though one of the best tools to do so. They can have the reasons why some armies are doing either better or doing worse, often armies being supported by just one or two really quite big interactions or key units or massive rules that just warp the entire army, and plus mentioned about things being better in different areas, local metas or regional metas, or some factions warping all the other armies' selections. All that being said though, it does feel like this table gives us a fairly accurate representation of what's strong and what isn't in Warhammer 40k right now, though I must admit I feel like there's a few entries on the table that seem like they're a bit higher or a bit lower than I would have expected. The way that Games Workshop usually gets their data is to look at tournament data, but not just looking towards the top end of tournaments, say the 5-round grand tournaments that people often like to look at for data comparison, but also look at all of the Rogue Trader tournaments, more small and casual ones with 3 rounds, and I think that's fair enough for them, as you get a lot more casual players playing in those, and in reality that's the way that a lot more people tend to play Warhammer. Ideally they want the game to be balanced both from a competitive and a casual level, and while they still talk about competitive play a lot, 10th edition is a lot more focused on casual compared with 9th edition, which seemed like it was very much an edition geared to tournament play. Broadly though, the win rate table isn't looking like it's in a particularly good place for Warhammer 40k right now, as I think most people would have expected. A few armies just enormously out of line, with Eldari and Genestealer cults being far higher than everything else, and then an awful lot of armies, perhaps partly with their win rate suppressed by the good factions, being well below the 45% win rate cutoff. Overall there's only 11 factions inside their ideal zone and 15 factions outside of it. Just in terms of being able to have a credible chance of winning with every army, this is much worse than say the tail end of 9th edition was. Playing any of the bottom armies into any of the top armies is going to be a real uphill struggle, provided the people playing the top armies have at least a bit of sense as to what they're doing and take somewhat sensible choices in their list. Focusing on bits of the table bit by bit, and first up we've got all the armies that are below their 45% win cutoff. Here we've got Astra Militarum, the Standard Space Marines Adeptus Astartes, Drukhari Blood Angels, Sisters World Eaters, Grey Knights, Admech, Death Guard, Tau Empire and Leagues of Votan. Broadly for army entries here, this is pretty much what I was expecting. It's pretty similar to the win rate video that I made a few weeks back that seems to have blown up a bit. I'll leave a link to that one down in the video description where I talk about each of the armies in a bit more detail. I don't think that really either the placing or the order of these really surprises me all that much. There are a few things I find a little bit curious though. From Leagues of Votan, almost all the data that I've seen from other sources has them a bit lower than 35%, more around the 30% mark, either a little bit above or a little bit below. I guess it might partly due to this being a slightly more casual dataset, where a skilled player might even have a better chance of making the worst army in the game work for them. I feel like a few of the other armies might well have been carried by certain units as well. Say the Adeptus Mechanicus I feel like are probably going to be doing a bit worse if they can't just fall back on breacher spam type things, and competitive Sisters lists tend to be running a whole load of tanks and things at the moment, plus Imperial allies, maybe overinflating things for them as well. In their Metawatch video, they specifically called out the bottom 4 armies in the game, Death Guard, Tau Empire, Leaguers of Votan and Admech, saying that they'll definitely address them with at least some buffs, and I wouldn't be too surprised to see at least some small improvements for everything else on this table. Clearly these guys are having a rough time of it, compared with even the mid-tier factions of 40k, never mind the stuff that's sticking out the top. In their video, they did also mention that stating some low 40s armies might well rise up a bit if they heavily nerf the top stuff, which I guess is probably true to an extent, but I would also say that literally every army on this list also needs some kind of help. Some of them do have a fair few fairly good choices, but they just have so much of their index that's mediocre and could use a small points drop, whether it's iconic units like the Blood Angel Sanguinary Guard, or some of the assault stuff like Witches for Drukhari. I think with a points update, I would quite like to see them go at least fairly heavy-handed with the generosity towards the lower performing factions. It'd be nice to have them kicked further into the midfield or towards the stronger side, as opposed to just not quite being quite as bad. In their video, they didn't really mention the middle of the pack armies at all, the ones that are within their win rate brackets. They only touched on a few of the top armies, saying that if they nerf the things that are doing really, really well, they might be the ones that are next in line that might be dominant, mentioning Thousand Sons, Chaos Demons and Tyranids there. Otherwise on this list we've also got Death Watch, which seems to be the strongest way to play Space Marines these days, Necrons, Orcs, Chaos Space Marines, Chaos Knights, Space Wolves, Dark Angels and Black Templars. I'd say that most of those and the order of them isn't really the biggest surprise, though in particular I think that Tyranids are only doing quite that well due to being able to hoover up tactical objectives ridiculously easy with flung out spore mines and things. Again, I feel like there's a non-zero chance of that being addressed in a future update of some sort, and perhaps the most surprising thing out of the data for me was seeing Space Wolves and Dark Angels both ranking at least fairly solidly ahead of standard Space Marine Adeptus Astartes. That just doesn't really seem to be too consistent with what I've seen elsewhere. As we talked about in a video the other day, it does look like their launch attachments are really quite solidly worse than the Space Marine Gladius, with people having a far higher chance to win with the Gladius compared with the Unforgiven detachment or the Space Wolf Sagas one. I'm kind of surprised to see them ranking really quite so far ahead, maybe the Space Wolves in particular, who I just don't really feel have all that many efficient choices in their index. In general, I would have said that Space Wolves are probably an army that needs a bit of help. I feel like if they're ranking them up here, then there's at least some danger that they don't receive any sort of major aid to their index if they think that they're basically fine. Certainly in grand tournaments with a more competitive list, Black Templars are doing solidly better than Space Wolves and Dark Angels anyway. Finally, they just talked about the 4 armies that are sticking their heads way above the parapets and are well above their 55% win rate target. Eldaria certainly being the obvious one here. They've got them on 67% and Genestealer Cults on 63%. Certainly seems that Games Workshop seem to agree that those two are the top 2 factions and probably most in lines for some sort of nerf when the balance update comes. 67% is pretty murderous for the Eldari, and that's even after the fairly major nerfs that they gave them from that first emergency balance pass. Things like Wraith Knights going up by a cool 100 points, Fire Prisms and D Cannons also increasing decently as well. In this discussion they still talked about all of those being potential problem units, though I still feel that the way that they have Strands of Fate with the 6s feeding into the devastating wounds so easily, that's at least part of the source of their strength, at least for the Wraith Knights and the D Cannons. Again, Eldaria just absolutely enormously ahead of the top armies that we had towards the end of 9th edition, where we saw win rates in the high 50s as opposed to the high 60s. Though after the first balance pass, maybe not quite on the same level as launch dates, Tyranids or Harlequins in 9th edition maybe. Otherwise, no real surprises with the Imperial Knights and Adeptus Custodians as well. They feel like they're a bit more gatekeeper armies to the top 2, not winning anywhere near as many big tournaments and things, but still being kind of oppressive just with their raw stats. I'm sure they'd be pretty dominant in smaller road trader tournaments with 3 rounds, just very easy armies to win a few games with their raw stats, plus having some very strong supporting options and things like the Custodians fight first, and the Imperial Knight feel no pain and rerolls all game long. Probably the sort of thing that could be addressed with some small points changes. I do kind of wonder if they might do something to adjust the Custodians fights first stratagem, which does seem kind of oppressive for a fair few other melee armies. Talking of balance changes and rules updates, they gave us just a few more details as to the next balance pass. They really seem to be drip feeding us information about it bit by bit with their updates here. We already knew that there's going to be a points update coming sometime in early autumn, potentially September for really quite a while now. In this update, they specifically called out the second weeks of September as the most likely date for that to come out. They tend to try and organise them so it doesn't clash with major events, and they have some of the flagship events of Warhammer 40k disrupted by them. In all the updates they'd said previously, they generally said that their philosophy was going to be points updates 4 times a year, so this one will be a points update one, and then they'll be saving major rules changes for a January balanced data slate update, where you might get some rules changes as well if they thought it were necessary. In this one though, they've at least implied that we might get some rules changes in September as well. The article itself specifically calls that out and says there's going to be both points and a balanced data slate in September, though the video is maybe a little bit less clear on that, saying points changes for definite and possibly some rules changes. I have a feeling that from the language they're using, it might just be some very small targeted things, as opposed to sweeping rules changes that affect all sorts of different factions, as we have seen with previous balanced data slates in the past. As for what they might change in the balanced data slate, as I mentioned the previous time round, I wouldn't be too surprised if Objective Control 0 units have some sort of nerf for scoring secondary objectives. In particular, it just feels plain weird that Tyranid Spore Mines can do that so easily and they can just automatically farm a bunch of victory points. Not that they're exactly one of the problem armies in the game at the moment, but it'd be nice to see them strong for non-gimmick mechanics. Again, they might mess around with Eldari mechanics, given that they're the single strongest army by a long way at the moment. It does feel like between their fate dice and their detachment rule, it's perhaps unnecessary amounts of power compared with some other factions. I think a lot of people were kind of surprised when they messed around with fate dice but didn't change the interaction with devastating wounds at all. That definitely feels like that could be one potential target if they do decide to mess around that further. Not saying they will though, and they could just change points. I feel like perhaps some of the most popular things they could do though might be changing something creatively for the bottom factions. Say for example Death Guard in particular would absolutely love an extra durability rule for literally all the feedback I've heard online about them. Maybe disgustingly resilient returning in some form, whether it's a feel no pain type save or -1 damage. I feel like really quite a lot of units are pointed ideally where they probably should be for the Death Guard, but they just don't really do all that many for the points. They probably just don't want to massively decrease the points on everything to make them into a weird Plague Horde type faction. It'll be interesting to see where they go with that. I feel like Eldar rules mechanics and secondary objectives might be the most likely thing. I'd guess it's probably going to be fairly light touch and mainly points focused. Overall though, good to see that they're acknowledging that there's a lot of armies that are both too strong and too weak at the moment, and I do honestly suspect that after a balance pass or two, 10th edition will be in a much more positive state than it is at the moment. So far we haven't actually had a balance pass that's tried to help out the struggling armies whatsoever, so this will be the first opportunity that Games Workshop has to help out armies like Leagues of Votann, Tau or Admech, and hopefully they manage to do something that makes them interesting to play in game and have a fair few of their units feel strong and not just one or two things. Then after that we'll be looking at codex releases. They did confirm that points will remain digital and be updated at the time, which I guess we were expecting already, and multiple detachments would make things a bit more complicated and interesting for the Space Marines and Tyranids to start with. And then after that the next balance update will be January, points updates and a balanced data slate if they feel that it's wanted or needed. Overall, I'd rate it as a fairly positive update. Games Workshop seem to be at least well aware that a lot of things are very out of balance in Warhammer 40k and are going to be making some changes to reflect that. Should be interesting to see what they come out with in September. Let me know your hopes and fears for your own faction with the updates and what you think they might do down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I will tend to cover Games Workshop's news and updates here on the channel. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.